On my birthday, my son put me on a flight to Japan. No hug, no cake, no return ticket. My cash was missing. My hotel didn't exist. I stayed quiet, holding it all inside. Weeks later, I walked back into my own living room while he toasted my disappearance with strangers. He never saw my lawyer step in. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. Margaret Hayes had never heard words sweeter than when her grown son told her, "Mom, you deserve this." 5 simple words, but they carried the weight of decades. They stitched together every sleepless night, every skipped meal, every sacrifice she had quietly folded into the fabric of motherhood. So when Daniel called from his office in Chicago, voice warm with a confidence that almost sounded like tenderness, she believed him. She didn't question his sudden decision to celebrate her 72nd birthday in Kyoto. She didn't ask how he remembered the dream she once whispered about cherry blossoms in Japan, a dream she had buried beneath stacks of bills and broken appliances. She just smiled into the receiver, her hand pressed against her chest as if holding her heart in place, and whispered, "You really mean it?" "Of course, Mom," Daniel laughed. "It's time someone took care of you for once, so." She clung to those words like a lifeline. That phone call came while she was pruning the rose bushes behind her little lake house in Minnesota. The soil was still frozen, the March air sharp with the tail of winter, but inside her something bloomed. She dropped onto the porch steps, letting the pale sunlight warm her face. "Kyoto," she whispered to herself. The sparrows at the feeder, her only witnesses. She hadn't left the country in decades. She hadn't left Minnesota in over a year. Yet here was her son, planning a once-in-a-lifetime gift just for her. Daniel told her he had already booked the flights. Business class. "You won't believe how comfortable it is, Mom," he teased. Margaret's chest swelled. For so long, she had taught herself not to expect grand gestures, to keep her joy small and private. But this was more than she had ever allowed herself to hope for. The week that followed was a blur of planning, though Daniel insisted he would handle everything. Old habits wouldn't let her stay idle. She dug out the suitcase she hadn't used since his college graduation, brushing off the dust like it was sacred. She aired out her blouses, folded scarves with care, and even bought compression socks she wasn't sure she needed. She spritzed lavender onto her travel pillow as though it were a charm against unease. In a quiet corner of the bookstore, she picked up 2 small gifts for Daniel's children, handmade bookmarks in an illustrated book of Japanese temples. Tucking them into her bag brought her a smile so soft it felt like a prayer. It was as though every silent sacrifice, every holiday spent alone, every shift she worked late into the night had returned to her in one radiant moment. She thought perhaps this was the universe's way of telling her she hadn't failed after all. Her sister Helen called midweek to check in. "Isn't Daniel always swamped with work?" she asked. Margaret laughed, surprised by Helen's tone. "He said he'll work remotely, but the trip is all for me." He remembered how I used to dream about Kyoto when he was little. There was a pause on the other end, then Helen said softly, "Maybe he's growing up." Margaret's throat tightened, and she agreed. Maybe he was. The night before the trip, Daniel flew into town for an early birthday dinner. Margaret had reserved a small Italian restaurant she loved, a place with warm lamps and bread that tasted like home. But Daniel canceled at the last minute. "I already booked a spot," he said. "Modern place, great reviews." They ended up in a sleek downtown restaurant, its walls steel and glass, its lights so bright they stripped the warmth from every table. Daniel's wife couldn't make it. The children were at a recital, and he barely looked up from his phone. Margaret wore the green blouse he once said made her look like a lucky penny, but he didn't notice. She filled the silence with gentle questions, asking about places he hoped to see, whether he was excited. "It's your trip, Mom," he muttered, thumbs flying over his phone. Halfway through the meal, he excused himself for a work call and vanished for nearly 2 hours. Margaret sat alone, sipping tea that had gone cold, trying not to feel like a stand-in at her own celebration. When Daniel finally returned, he acted as though nothing had happened. She paid the bill. Back at home, she asked if he could print the flight itinerary and hotel confirmation for her. "It's all digital now, Mom. Relax. I've got it," he said, brushing her worry aside. She reminded herself that he was under pressure. That work always pressed on him like a shadow. This was still a generous thing he was doing. She couldn't let her doubts spoil it. Later that night, Margaret sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea, the moonlight spilling across the lake. She whispered to the glass, "He's changing. He really is." For the first time in years, she let herself believe it. She had always believed in grace, in patience, in forgiveness. Revenge belonged to stories, not mothers. But sometimes, she would learn, grace could be mistaken for weakness. Sometimes people didn't grow up. They only grew better at hiding their intentions. At that moment, though, Margaret didn't see the shadow ahead. She only saw the possibility of spring. The night before her departure should have been a celebration, but it felt like a rehearsal for disappointment. Margaret had imagined the comfort of her favorite Italian restaurant, where the servers knew her name and the dim glow of the lamps softened every wrinkle on her face. She had booked it weeks in advance, picturing a warm meal with her son, just the two of them, a toast to mark the beginning of their journey. But Daniel had other plans. "I already booked a place," he told her over the phone. His voice rushed, distracted. "Modern, great reviews. Trust me, Mom." She canceled her reservation reluctantly and followed him downtown, her heart tugging her towards something familiar, even as her steps carried her into the unknown. The restaurant he chose gleamed with steel and glass, the kind of space designed to impress strangers but not to comfort anyone who lingered. Fluorescent lights washed everything pale, stripping warmth from the evening. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant, sharp instead of savory. Margaret had dressed carefully for this night, slipping into the green blouse Daniel once adored. Years ago, when he was immoral, he would tug at its sleeve and call her his lucky penny. She had hoped for even a flicker of recognition, a smile, a soft word. But Daniel never looked up long enough from his phone to notice. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, the glow casting shadows across his face, making him look younger and older all at once, like a man pretending to be present while already somewhere else. They sat across from each other in silence, broken only by the hum of the air vents and the faint clink of cutlery from other tables. Margaret tried to fill the empty air. "Are you excited for Kyoto? Have you thought about the cherry blossoms? Or maybe the canals?" Daniel barely shrugged. "It's your trip, Mom. Just enjoy it." His thumbs never stopped moving, tapping replies to a world she couldn't see. Halfway through the meal, his phone buzzed again. He stood abruptly, muttered "work call," and disappeared into the night. Margaret sat alone for nearly 2 hours, her tea cooling into bitterness while couples and colleagues drifted past her table. She watched the door every few minutes, forcing herself to smile at the waiter who came to refill her cup, pretending she wasn't abandoned in plain sight. When Daniel finally returned, his face calm, his voice casual, he didn't apologize. He acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Margaret didn't argue. She paid the bill herself, sliding her credit card across the table with a hand that trembled only slightly. On the drive home, she clung to patience the way she always had. Daniel was busy. He had responsibilities she never fully understood. That was the way of things between them. Still, she allowed herself a tiny ache of disappointment, hidden deep where he wouldn't see it. Back at the lake house, she asked gently if he could print the flight itinerary and hotel confirmation, just in case her phone battery died during the trip. The request was simple, practical, but Daniel brushed it aside with a dismissive laugh. "It's all digital now, Mom. Relax, I've got it handled." The words stung more than she let on. Relax. How many times had she heard that from him? When he forgot to pick her up from the hospital after surgery, when her account had overdrafted because of an accidental charge, when he canceled plans for Mother's Day but was seen golfing the next morning. Relax, Mom. Stop worrying. Margaret swallowed her unease and told herself it was only the generational gap, a difference in how they lived their lives. She was from a world of paper, of confirmations folded neatly in purses and tucked into drawers. He was from a world of screens and passwords. It was easier to believe that than to believe he simply didn't care. Later, when the house fell quiet, Margaret sat by the wide window with a steaming cup of chamomile tea. The moon hung over the frozen lake, its light shimmering across the water like silver thread. She pressed her palm to the glass, letting the chill seep into her skin. "He's changing," she whispered aloud, as though the lake might answer. "He really is." Her reflection in the window seemed to nod back at her, tired but hopeful. For the first time in years, she let herself imagine she hadn't failed as a mother, that perhaps all the sacrifices, selling her brooch for his tutoring, pawning her wedding ring for his tuition, working double shifts when others rested, had brought her to this moment. A trip to Kyoto, a chance to see the cherry blossoms she had dreamed of her entire life, a gift from the boy she had raised into a man. She sipped her tea slowly, savoring the warmth as it slid down her throat. In that quiet moment, Margaret allowed herself the luxury of hope. She didn't know yet that what lay ahead would test her more than any sleepless night she had endured. She didn't know the cracks in her son's gestures were already widening into fractures too deep to ignore. For now, she only knew that the next morning would take her farther than she had been in decades, across an ocean toward a dream she thought had been buried. And she held on to the belief, fragile but glowing, that Daniel's gift was genuine. The silence in the car was thick enough to choke on. Daniel drove with his eyes fixed on the glowing screen in his hand, his thumbs darting across it like a pianist rehearsing scales. Margaret sat beside him, her hands folded over the hem of her cardigan, her chest rising and falling too quickly. She had packed her suitcase hours before he arrived, unable to sleep, unable to trust the alarm clock. When his knock finally came at dawn, she greeted him with a smile that felt thin, rehearsed. He hadn't said happy birthday. He hadn't even looked at her long enough to notice the nervous brightness in her eyes. At the airport curb, he lifted her suitcase from the trunk, handed it to her with one hand still gripping his phone, and said only, "Text me when you land." No hug, no photo, not even a smile. Then he slid back into the driver's seat and pulled away without looking back, as though it were another Monday morning, another errand to cross off. Margaret stood frozen, one hand clutching the handle of her suitcase, the other gripping her passport so tightly it left a faint crease in the cover. The exhaust from Daniel's car mingled with the cool morning air, and before she knew it, he was swallowed by the tide of traffic. She whispered after him, though he couldn't hear, "It's my birthday." Her voice broke into silence. Inside the terminal, everything seemed too bright, too busy, as if the world had no patience for the quiet devastation blooming inside her chest. She moved through the motions, check-in, security, waiting at the gate, but her mind kept drifting back to the restaurant the night before, to the long hours alone at that cold steel table. She remembered the green blouse she had chosen, the way it had once meant something to him. She remembered the way his laugh used to rise like sunlight when he was small. She tried to hold on to that boy, the one who pressed his cheek against her laundry and called it home. Now she sat at the gate, her fingers brushing the fabric of that same blouse as if it might anchor her. Daniel's words echoed, "Relax, Mom." She wondered if he even noticed how cruel that word had become. When the boarding call came, Margaret stood with the others, clutching her ticket as though it were proof of something more than travel. Her steps felt heavy, weighted with a dread she couldn't quite name. She told herself she was overthinking, that mothers often felt too much, that silence was sometimes just another word for trust. But beneath all her reasonings, a sharp voice whispered, "He doesn't want to be here. He doesn't want you to be here either." She shook it off. This was her birthday. This was the dream she had kept folded away for decades. Kyoto would be her gift, her proof that Daniel was finally becoming the man she believed he could be. The plane lifted into the sky, and Margaret pressed her forehead to the window, watching the earth shrink beneath her. For a brief moment, she let herself imagine cherry blossoms falling like snow, delicate petals brushing against her skin, softening the ache inside her. She tried to believe that tomorrow, when Daniel joined her in Kyoto, everything would feel different. The silence between them would dissolve into laughter the way it once had. She wanted to believe. She needed to. But when the plane touched down and the doors opened to Kyoto's clean, sunlit air, the unease returned. Travelers streamed past her in every direction, their voices a blur of languages she couldn't understand. She pulled out her phone to find the hotel confirmation Daniel promised to send. The screen flickered, warning her at 2% battery. Before she could open her email, the device died in her hand. Her pulse quickened. She checked her purse, passport, one credit card, no cash. The $200 she always tucked behind her ID was gone. She told herself she must have left it behind, rushing out in the morning haze. She clung to that thought, though it felt thin, brittle. Margaret sat on a bench near the taxi line, clutching her bag, breathing through the panic. "You've traveled before," she whispered. "You've survived worse." She thought of the years she worked double shifts, of the lonely Christmas mornings, of burying Robert and raising Daniel alone. She was strong. She had to be. Still, a weight pressed on her chest. Something wasn't right. She stood, steadied herself, and flagged a taxi. On the back of her boarding pass, she had scribbled a name Daniel once mentioned, Hotel Ryan Kyoto. She held it up to the driver, who nodded politely and started the engine. As the taxi rolled through narrow streets lined with paper lanterns and quiet shops, the city unfolded like a dream she had longed for all her life. But Margaret couldn't feel the beauty. Her fingers dug into the strap of her purse, her heart thudding against her ribs. All she wanted was to reach the hotel, to breathe, to believe again. Yet she couldn't silence the memory of Daniel's last words at the airport. "Text me when you land." No warmth, no promise, just dismissal. If your child rushed through your birthday like a chore, leaving you alone with silence instead of love, would you have spoken up? Or would you, like Margaret, have swallowed the ache and carried on, hoping it was only your imagination? Tell me in the comments, because sometimes the hardest truth is the one we can't bring ourselves to say aloud. The air in Kyoto felt different, as though spring itself had been poured into every street, every lantern-lit corner. Margaret stepped off the plane and breathed it in, warm and sweet, a fragrance that should have filled her with wonder. Instead, unease gnawed at her chest. She clutched her carry-on tighter, trying to steady her pulse as she followed the stream of travelers toward baggage claim. Her phone, lifeless in her hand, mocked her. Just hours before, she had trusted Daniel's words. "It's all digital now, Mom. Relax." Now there was nothing but a black screen and a hollow ache where reassurance should have been. She whispered to herself that she would be fine, that she could figure it out. She had survived too many storms to crumble at an airport. Still, the worry pressed harder when she reached the taxi stand. No itinerary, no hotel address, no cash. She checked her purse again, as though the missing bills might magically appear. The pocket was empty. She told herself she must have forgotten them at home, though a darker thought flickered. Had Daniel removed them while she wasn't looking? She pushed it away quickly, unwilling to believe her son capable of something so deliberate. On the back of her boarding pass, she had scribbled a name Daniel once mentioned, Hotel Ryan Kyoto. She showed it to the driver, who nodded and guided her into the cab. As the car moved through quiet streets, Margaret pressed her forehead against the window, watching paper lanterns sway gently in the evening air. The city looked like a painting come to life, each storefront narrow and intimate, each corner glowing with history. But beauty couldn't reach her. Her stomach twisted with dread. 20 minutes later, she stood at the front desk of the hotel, offering her name with a hopeful smile. The young woman behind the counter typed it in, frowned, then typed again. Slower this time, she looked up apologetically. "I'm sorry, no reservation." Margaret's heart gave a sharp, panicked beat. "Please try under Daniel Hayes. My son booked it." The receptionist repeated again. Nothing. No record, no email, no payment. She even turned the screen to show her. Margaret's name did not exist in the system. Her throat tightened. She asked if the staff could call the airline to confirm her return flight, clinging to the possibility that maybe it was just a mistake. The young woman nodded kindly and made the call. Margaret sat on a velvet bench by the elevator, her pulse hammering in her ears, her hands trembling against her lap. Minutes passed before the receptionist returned, her expression pale and careful. "There is no return flight booked," she said softly, the words carved into Margaret like a blade. She sat very still, as though movement might make the truth more real. No hotel, no return flight. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. Her son hadn't brought her here to make memories. He had sent her away. Margaret rose slowly and walked out of the hotel, her legs stiff and unsteady. She crossed to a nearby bench beneath a row of cypress trees, lowering herself as though her bones carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Around her, Kyoto moved with a quiet grace, bicycles gliding down narrow lanes, lanterns flickering above shop doors, voices mingling in languages she couldn't decipher. The world was alive, but she felt erased. Her mind began to unravel threads of memory, each one cutting deeper. Daniel's first fever, when she stayed awake all night with a cool cloth against his forehead. The peanut butter sandwiches she cut into triangles because he once said rectangles made him sad. The way he used to clutch her blouse on laundry day, inhaling its scent and calling it home. And then came the darker memories, the ones she had pushed aside for years. Missed birthdays, sharp words when she asked about his health, rolled eyes when she inquired about his work. The Mother's Day brunch canceled for work while he posed at a golf course the next morning. The little dismissals, the careless rejections, all of them stacking into something she had never dared to name. Her chest ached as she thought of the brooch she pawned to pay for his SAT tutor, the wedding ring she sold to cover his tuition when his loan didn't arrive, the second job she took just so he would never feel the hunger she had known. Every sacrifice she had made, and now she sat alone in a foreign country, discarded like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, not for warmth, but because she needed to feel the pressure of something holding her together. Her shame burned hotter than her grief. Not shame for what Daniel had done, but for how long she had chosen to believe his neglect was love. Her eyes blurred as she stared at the city before her, its beauty wasted on a woman unraveling. She wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. Instead, she sat frozen, hollow, her heart pounding in silence, until at last her legs moved on their own, carrying her aimlessly down a side street. That was when she stumbled upon the cafe. Tucked between two bookstores, its awning faded and its windows glowing softly, it looked unremarkable from the outside. Yet inside, warmth radiated. The barista greeted her gently, guiding her toward a corner table, offering a worn menu, and, with a kindness that nearly undid her, an old charger for her phone. Her body trembled as she held the tablet he handed her, Wi-Fi, a fragile lifeline. Margaret clung to it like oxygen. Her fingers, clumsy with nerves, typed in the password to her old Gmail account. She hadn't used it in years, keeping it only for receipts and photographs, but now it was her only hope. When her inbox opened, she searched for the hotel email Daniel had sworn he sent. Nothing. She checked her bank account. Blocked. Her credit card. Declined. A sick wave of dread rolled through her, but before despair could swallow her whole, her eyes caught something at the top of her inbox. It was a forwarded email chain, one she wasn't meant to see, and within moments of opening it, the truth she had been afraid to face came crashing down, sharper and crueler than she ever imagined. The message burned through her like fire. Margaret stared at the email chain, her hands trembling as though the tablet itself carried heat. Daniel's words were there in black and white, words he never meant her to see, words that carved through the last fragile strands of trust she still held. She's slipping, forgetting appointments, repeating herself. I've been looking into power of attorney. I want to handle it quietly. Her niece Emily had written first, her tone laced with concern. She forgot to pay taxes last year. She's been repeating herself a lot. Maybe it's time someone stepped in. Daniel's reply cut sharper than any accusation. Exactly. She's not safe managing her life alone. I think it's time to put things in order. Margaret blinked hard, her chest aching as though the air itself had turned heavy. She hadn't forgotten the taxes. There had been an IRS mistake, the corrected form still tucked neatly in a drawer back home. The dentist appointments? She had made two because the hygienist was booked out for months. None of it was incompetence. None of it was decline. It was ordinary life twisted into evidence. Her son painting her as fragile, confused, unfit. Not because she was losing her mind, but because he wanted control. She leaned back against the chair, her body rigid, her knuckles white as she gripped the tablet. The cafe around her hummed softly with the scent of espresso and the gentle clink of ceramic cups. But Margaret felt as though the world had tilted, leaving her suspended in a place where gravity itself betrayed her. Her son wasn't concerned for her well-being. He was building a case against her. She saw it all at once. The missing cash, the dead phone, the absent reservation, the vanished return flight. None of it was an accident. It was the perfect storm Daniel had designed to prove she was incapable of traveling on her own, incapable of living on her own, incapable of being trusted with the life she had built from decades of sacrifice. Rage rose inside her, steady and unfamiliar. It wasn't the sharp sting of anger that burned fast and faded. This was heavier, rooted, like something that had been waiting years to surface. For the first time in days, her trembling slowed. Her breath steadied. She wasn't broken. She wasn't lost. She was furious. Margaret opened a new email, her fingers pressing the keys with deliberate precision. She typed the name she hadn't spoken in years. Thomas Green, her old lawyer, the man who had once handled Robert's estate with unflinching loyalty. He was steady, sharp, unafraid, the kind of man you could call at 3 in the morning and know he would answer. Subject line, urgent, power of attorney challenge. Body, immediate action required. Daniel building false claims. Need injunction. Call me. Her hands stilled above the keys for a moment, her chest heaving. Then she pressed send. The tablet beeped minutes later. A reply. 3 words that made her spine straighten and her lungs finally fill with air. Call me now. She stepped outside into the cool Kyoto evening, phone pressed to her ear, her voice trembling as she said, "It's me." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Margaret, I was wondering when you'd call." His voice was calm, steady, as if he had already been preparing for this moment. It was 3 in the morning in Minneapolis, but she heard the clink of a coffee cup and the rustle of papers. He was already at work. She told him everything, slowly, clearly, even the parts that made her feel foolish. How she hadn't printed the itinerary. How she let Daniel handle all the details. How she believed every word because she wanted to. "You're not foolish," Thomas said firmly. "You were being a mother." He was being a manipulator. Those words cracked something inside her, the tears she had been holding back since the hotel finally spilled, hot and relentless. But beneath them was steel. Within hours, Thomas filed an emergency motion with the county court to freeze all financial activity tied to her estate. He drafted letters to Daniel's attorney, warning that any attempt to access her accounts, her deeds, or her medical files would be considered fraud. It wasn't revenge, it was defense, a shield drawn at last. Thomas told her to conserve her strength, to document everything, to be ready. "I've seen sons like him before," he said quietly. "They always underestimate the woman they came from." Margaret stood in the dim light of the cafe doorway, her heart pounding with something new. Not fear, not shame, resolve. Daniel had left her in a foreign country, convinced she would fail, convinced she would crumble. But he had forgotten who she was before she became his mother. A woman who rebuilt her life after burying her husband. A woman who kept her home, dollar by dollar, shift by shift. A woman who never asked for recognition, yet deserved it all the same. She closed her eyes and whispered into the Kyoto night, "You will not erase me." If your own child tried to take everything you built, would you fight back or would you surrender to the story they wanted the world to believe? Share your thoughts below. Someone out there needs to know they are not powerless. The cafe became her anchor. While the world outside bustled with voices and bicycles and the rhythm of a city she couldn't understand, Margaret sat in the corner with a tablet before her, piecing herself back together one message at a time. Every reply from Thomas was another stone in a wall rising between her and Daniel's scheme. By morning, Thomas had filed the injunctions, freezing her accounts and property against Daniel's reach. He sent copies of the documents straight to her inbox, urging her to keep them safe. "The courts will move," he told her, "but you need to hold steady. Document everything. Rest where you can, and Margaret, don't doubt yourself. You see more clearly than he wants you to believe." She reread his words again and again, letting them settle into her bones. The shame that had wrapped around her shoulders like a shroud began to loosen, replaced by something sturdier. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't broken. She was waking up. Later that afternoon, she called Helen back home. The moment her sister's voice came through, Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to spill everything in one desperate rush, but she forced herself to speak with the same clarity Thomas had used. She gave Helen a list. Check the house, see if anything had been moved, watch the mail for legal notices, keep an eye on the gardener, and whether strangers had been walking the perimeter. And then, almost as an afterthought, she added softly, "Water the roses for me." The silence on the other end stretched before Helen answered. "I'll take care of it," she said firmly. Then her voice dropped lower, heavy with grief and fury both. "I never thought I'd say this, But Daniel doesn't know who he's dealing with. Margaret closed her eyes, gripping the phone tighter. Neither did I, she whispered, realizing how far she had drifted from the woman she once was. For years, she had lived as though her worth existed only in the spaces Daniel allowed. Now she felt the old fire stirring, the one that had carried her through widowhood, through single motherhood, through nights where her body ached from double shifts and her heart ached from silence. She booked a flight home, a single seat, last row with a layover in Seoul. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch at the price. She clicked purchase and whispered to herself, I'm coming back. The barista at the cafe hailed her a cab that evening, his gentle bow steadying her nerves more than he would ever know. Margaret checked into a small hostel on the edge of the city, run by an elderly couple who spoke little English but wrapped her in kindness. They gave her hot rice porridge, thick quilts that smelled faintly of cedar, and a room small enough to feel safe. The woman pressed Margaret's hand in her own, her eyes warm and steady, and for the first time in days, Margaret felt as though she might not fall apart. She slept 9 straight hours. When she woke, the sun was already bright through the thin curtains, and for the first time since Daniel's call, her chest didn't feel hollow. She brushed her hair, tied her scarf, and looked in the mirror. The woman staring back wasn't defeated. She was resolute. On the plane, turbulence rocked the cabin, but Margaret sat steady, her hands folded over the folder Thomas had sent. She read every page, underlining notes in the margins, her eyes tracing each line of defense being built for her. At the top of the last document, Thomas had scrawled a single note. Stand tall. You're not asking for your life back. You're claiming it. The words filled her with a quiet power. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishing Daniel. It was about survival, about refusing to be erased. As the plane descended into Minneapolis, she pressed her forehead to the window. Below her stretched the frozen lake she had lived beside for decades, white and gleaming under the late winter sun. Home. The sight of it stirred something deep inside her, not relief, not yet, but readiness. At baggage claim, she moved slowly, her suitcase bumping behind her, her coat wrapped tight around her shoulders. She didn't rush, she didn't cower. Each step felt like an answer to every silent dismissal. Every time Daniel told her to relax, every time he dismissed her as fragile. The taxi ride home was quiet. The driver hummed faintly to a tune on the radio, but Margaret sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the familiar streets of her neighborhood. The houses looked the same, trimmed hedges, snow shoveled neatly into piles, mailboxes leaning slightly from winter's weight. But as her own driveway came into view, her breath caught. 3 cars sat parked outside. One was Daniel's silver sedan, crooked in the snow the way he always left it. The other 2 gleamed newer, sleeker, with out-of-state plates. Through her living room window, lights blazed too bright, white where she had always chosen soft amber. And inside, she could see shadows moving, voices rising in laughter. Margaret's heart pounded. She wasn't walking back into silence. She was walking into a storm already raging inside her own home. Imagine stepping through your own front door and finding your child celebrating your disappearance. Margaret stood at the end of her driveway, her boots crunching against frozen gravel, her breath fogging the winter air. Through the window she could see him, Daniel, standing in the middle of her living room, glass of champagne raised high. The soft amber glow she had always chosen for her porch lights was gone, replaced by blinding white bulbs that stripped every corner bare. Strangers filled the space where her memories lived, their laughter echoing off the walls, their hands reaching for the furniture she had polished for decades. One of them, a woman with a slick leather folder, leaned forward toward Daniel. He lifted a manila envelope above his head like a trophy. It's all wrapped up, he said, his voice smooth, smug. Signed, sealed, delivered. She's in Japan, completely out of the loop. The strangers clapped, raising their glasses. Margaret's pulse roared in her ears. She placed her hand on the handle of her suitcase, steadying herself. Then she walked forward. Slowly, deliberately, she opened her own front door without knocking. The warmth of the house hit her face like a slap. Laughter stopped mid-breath. Every head turned. The champagne froze in crystal flutes. Daniel's mouth dropped open, the envelope slipping from his fingers. "Mom," he stammered, his voice breaking. Margaret let her suitcase rest at her feet, shutting the door behind her with a quiet click that carried the weight of thunder. Her eyes swept across the room, over the rug she and Robert had chosen on their 20th anniversary, the lamp she had saved for months to buy, the couch where Daniel had once fallen asleep with picture books spread across his chest, every piece of her life used now as props in a celebration of her erasure. "Didn't expect me so soon, did you?" Her voice was calm, almost soft, but the silence it drew was sharp as glass. Daniel swallowed hard, glancing toward the strangers as though they might rescue him. I... I thought you were still in Kyoto." "I was," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "And now I'm not." The front door opened again, and Thomas Green stepped in, coat dusted with snow, a thick folder tucked under his arm. His presence filled the room with quiet authority. He opened the folder and spoke clearly. "Mr. Daniel Hayes, you are hereby served. Emergency injunction. Asset freeze. Revocation of all pending power of attorney filings." He handed the papers to the notary, who shifted uncomfortably before placing them back on the table. The strangers began to gather their belongings, murmuring apologies, their gazes sliding away from Margaret as though she were a flame too bright to face. Within minutes, only Daniel remained, pale and twitching, his champagne glass abandoned on the rug. "Why are you doing this?" His voice cracked, more wounded boy than grown man. Margaret tilted her head, her gaze steady. "You mean protecting what's mine?" For the first time in years, Daniel looked like a child caught red-handed. Not the successful man he had tried to become, not the manipulator who thought he could rewrite her life, but a boy cornered by the truth he had never expected her to wield. She walked past him into the kitchen, her hand gliding along the counter she had scrubbed 1,000 times. Still smooth, still hers. Turning back, she said evenly, "You can leave now." Daniel didn't move. His mouth opened, then closed again. His hands shook at his sides. Thomas stepped forward, his tone measured but firm. "You no longer have legal residence here. Any refusal to vacate will be considered trespassing." Daniel's eyes darted between them, searching for a crack, for softness, for the forgiveness Margaret had always offered. But she only stood there, shoulders square, her presence filling the room that was hers, that had always been hers. "You'll regret this," he whispered at last, his face pale with rage and fear. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. "No, you will." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, undeniable. Daniel grabbed his coat, his movements jerky, graceless. The front door slammed behind him, the echo rattling the frame. Silence filled the house once more. But this time it wasn't empty, it was peace reclaiming its place. Margaret walked slowly to the counter, lifted the abandoned champagne glass, and poured its contents down the sink. She wiped the counter clean, turned the thermostat back to 70, and switched the porch light to its soft amber glow. Then she lowered herself into her favorite chair, closed her eyes, and let the quiet settle. For the first time in years, she was home. If you opened your front door and found your child celebrating your erasure, would you scream, collapse, or walk in with the strength of everything you've survived? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be the reminder someone else needs tonight. The days that followed moved with the weight of stone. Margaret awoke each morning to the same frozen lake outside her window, its surface gleaming like glass beneath the pale sun, and she felt both steadied and haunted by its silence. Her house smelled of cedar and coffee again, the way it used to, but the echoes of Daniel's betrayal lingered in every room. She could still hear the laughter of strangers bouncing off her walls, the sound of her son's voice announcing her absence like a victory. Thomas came often, sometimes with papers, sometimes just with his calm presence. He explained each step carefully, making sure she understood the progress. The court had accepted the injunction, the accounts were secure, the deed to her home untouched. He assured her that Daniel's petition for power of attorney had been thrown out, his credibility shredded by the evidence of deception. Margaret listened, nodded, signed where she needed to, but beneath it all, she felt the slow grind of grief. The courtroom itself was cold, with long wooden benches and lights that hummed faintly overhead. Margaret sat straight-backed in her navy wool coat, hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed ahead. Daniel sat only a few feet away, his suit pressed, His hair slicked back, but his face betrayed him. The smugness was gone. He looked smaller, restless, tapping his fingers against the table as though rhythm could anchor him. When the judge asked for testimony, Thomas's voice cut through the room, calm and precise. He laid out Daniel's pattern, the withheld information, the fabricated narrative of decline, the attempt to strand his own mother abroad. Each word was a nail in a coffin Daniel had built for himself. Margaret watched her son's shoulders sink lower with every detail, and though pain twisted inside her, she did not look away. When it was her turn, she rose slowly. The room tilted for a moment, then steadied as she placed one hand on the railing. Her voice did not shake. She spoke of the dinner where Daniel disappeared for hours, of the airport farewell without a hug, of arriving in Kyoto with no reservation, no return ticket, no money. She spoke of the email, the words that cut deeper than any blade. She's slipping, forgetting appointments, repeating herself, lies written by her son's hand. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke of the truth, the bills always paid, the house always kept, the roses tended each summer, the photographs she had organized by year, the recipes she knew by heart, the names of neighbors she greeted each morning. She was not failing. She was not lost. She was living. The judge listened, eyes steady, hands folded, and when Margaret finished, the silence in the room felt sacred. Even Daniel did not raise his head. The ruling came swiftly. Daniel's petition was dismissed in its entirety. Any future attempts to assume authority over his mother's affairs would be met with immediate sanction. Margaret retained full control of her estate, her accounts, her home. The words were final, sharp, and liberating. Outside the courthouse, the winter air bit at her cheeks, but Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. Thomas touched her arm gently. "You did more than defend yourself today," he said. "You proved him wrong in the only place that matters." Margaret nodded, her breath clouding in the air, her heart both heavy and free. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She simply stood still, letting the cold wind wash through her, carrying away the last of her silence. That evening, back at the lake house, she moved slowly through each room. She adjusted the curtains, polished the table, lit a single candle on the mantel. The house seemed to breathe with her, each familiar corner reclaiming its place. She placed the court documents in the drawer beside Robert's photograph, resting her hand on the frame for a moment. His steady eyes seemed to meet hers as if to say, "You endured. You rose." Later, she brewed tea and carried it to her chair by the window. The lake shimmered under the moonlight, silver and unbroken. Margaret wrapped the quilt around her shoulders, sipped slowly, and let the warmth spread through her. The house was hers again. Her life was hers again. But the wound remained. The knowledge that her own son had plotted against her, that he had seen her not as a mother, not as a woman, but as an obstacle to be removed, it sat deep, unhealed. She did not know if forgiveness would ever find a place here. What she knew was this: she had survived. She had not been erased. The quiet of the house no longer felt hollow. It felt earned. It felt like peace stitched back together by hands that had worked, sacrificed, endured. Margaret leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and whispered into the night, "I am still here." Spring arrived slowly at the lake, the ice breaking apart in wide silver sheets that drifted toward the reeds. Each morning, Margaret watched the thaw from her window, her tea warming her hands, the steady rhythm of the season's return anchoring her in ways no court ruling ever could. The days had grown quieter, but not empty. Helen came by often, her laughter filling the kitchen the way it had when they were girls. She brought fresh bread, jars of honey, and the steady presence of someone who knew when to speak and when to sit in silence. Together they planted new rose bushes along the side of the house, Margaret's fingers pressing the earth firm around each stem. The soil clung to her hands, grounding her in the truth that life still grew, even after storms. Letters began to arrive, neighbors who had heard fragments of the story, distant cousins who remembered her kindness, even an old student from her days volunteering at the library. They wrote words of support, words that reminded her she was not invisible. She pinned them to a corkboard in the study, each note a small beacon against the shadows Daniel had tried to cast. Yet at night, when the house settled into its hush, memories returned. She thought of Daniel's first steps on this very floor, the way his tiny hands clutched hers as though the world would crumble without her. She thought of his laughter echoing down the hall, his drawings taped crookedly on the refrigerator. Love and betrayal lived side by side inside her, two truths that refused to cancel each other out. She did not hate him. That would have been easier. What she felt was heavier, harder to name. A mourning for the son she thought she had, for the bond she believed unbreakable. There were moments she almost reached for the phone, almost dialed his number, almost asked him why. But she stopped each time, her hand falling to her lap, her breath catching in her throat. Some silences protected more than they wounded. Instead, she poured her energy into rebuilding. With Thomas's guidance, she restructured her accounts, placed her home in a trust, and established clear instructions for her care should she ever truly need it. Not because she doubted herself now, but because she would not give Daniel or anyone else the chance to write her story again. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the lake shimmered gold, Margaret carried a chair onto the porch. She sat wrapped in her quilt, a notebook resting on her lap. She began to write, not legal notes, not lists of bills or tasks, but her own story. Page by page, she traced the path from her girlhood to her widowhood, from the sacrifices that carved her hands rough to the triumph of reclaiming her voice. She wrote the truth as she had lived it, unsoftened, unbroken. The words flowed steadily, her pen scratching against paper like a heartbeat. For years she had let others narrate her life, teachers praising her patience, neighbors admiring her devotion, her son dismissing her as fragile. Now she told it herself, and in the telling, she found something she had almost lost: dignity. Weeks passed and the roses bloomed, their petals opened wide, crimson against the pale siding of the house. Margaret stood in the garden one morning, scissors in hand, and cut a single stem. She placed it in a vase on the mantel beside Robert's photograph. The bloom leaned gently toward the frame, as though bowing. "I kept going," she whispered to the picture, her voice steady, almost fierce. "And I'll keep going still." That night she sat again by the window, the moonlight soft on her face. She sipped her tea slowly, breathing in the quiet that now felt like a companion rather than a cage. She had not chosen this path, but she had walked it with every ounce of strength she possessed. And though the wound remained, though forgiveness might never come, she knew the most important truth. She was still here. She was still herself. Her story would not end in silence. It would end in survival. If this journey has reached you, if Margaret's strength has touched something inside you, take a moment to share it. Let her story remind someone else that they too are not powerless, that even in betrayal there is a way forward, and even in loneliness, there is dignity. Your voice matters. Share it. Pass it on.